Hello and welcome to another SDAQ&A. My very special guest today is Dr. Steve Daly. How are you, Steve?
Doing well.
Great to have you
Thank
on the
you.
show again.
Thank you, St. Peter the Great. Always good to be with you.
As I think I've said this. I think we've had a chat since I saw you in February at Loma Linda at the former Adventist Fellowship,
Yes.
and I think I mentioned this already. I think we've done a show since then. But I really enjoyed catching up with you and meeting you in person. And you were so gracious. You let me sing in your church and
Loved it.
took me out to lunch after. It was fantastic. Do you know, Steve, that every single meal I had while I was there was Mexican, and I loved
Excellent.
it. It was breakfast, Mexican for breakfast. It was fantastic. We don't have Mexican food over here like that. So yeah, so it's great to have you on the program. One thing I noticed actually, and I've said it to a lot of people, is that as a part, I'd gotten to know you with our controversial interviews. They didn't seem controversial to me, but they've kicked off a lot of conversations all the time. But when I saw you at work as a pastor in your church, you were all about pastoral care. You were gracious to people, caring, listening, had a beautiful program, prayed for people. It was just a fantastic experience seeing that side of you as well.
Yeah, we loved having you.
Thank you. Now, I just want to bring up on the screen quickly two, where have they gone? There we go. This is the one that kind of, I guess, most people heard about you in recent times, the Ellen G. White psychobiography, and then the recent book. And I think you're working on another one, aren't you? You've got a
Yeah, every day I put up an
yeah,
excerpt from the new one on
yeah,
my.
yeah. I've been reading that. Has that come up on the screen? There we go.
White
Uh,
Estate book. Yeah.
White Estate Fraud, and that was a great book as well. Now, today we are planning just to riff. We're just going to chat all things Ellen White and kind of just see where we go. But I think you were mentioning that you wanted to kind of just have a bit of a right of reply to some of the things you'd heard in a recent interview. And so I thought, yeah, maybe
Yeah,
start there.
lots of times I don't get a chance to join the program itself, but in the last few weeks I was able to go to your archives and listen to a whole bunch of programs, and that was excellent. I really love them. I really love these young guys coming up: Thunder Lauriston and Miles Christian and Mike Colburn. All of them
Mhm.
I've interacted with, and they had them on the thread. And
Yeah,
um,
Frank Merendino.
yeah, I really think the future's bright with all these young minds that are joining in.
Mm,
That whatever the Adventist Church might have been hoping for, that the old people would die off. I think they're not getting their wish in that
yeah,
regard. you
yeah,
know, I love seeing these young guys that are sharp and doing their research and
yeah.
holding the church accountable. And I really do think that the church is in big trouble. I think they're imploding, and these young people have a lot to do with it. There's never been any church hit with so much stuff. I just made out a list of the websites and books and publications that are just devoted to exposing the dishonesty of Adventism and the error of Adventism. And we came up with a list of 75 that I put
Oh,
on my thread this morning. And that's, I'm sure, not comprehensive. In fact, I added more to it today just from comments on the thread. So, Adventism is really under siege as far as being hit from all directions right now. And rightly so, because you would think that a cult like Mormonism or something would have more people attacking it than the Adventists, but that's not true. The Adventists have way more people, and I think Mormons have been more honest about the
mm,
problem with Joseph Smith. And, They've even written books, and they've had to play the Book of Mormon, and they even make fun of themselves. And
Yeah.
Adventists just aren't willing to do that.
Yeah.
They're into suppression to the highest degree, and that's one reason the White Estate Fraud book isn't getting as much attention, because they're trying to not even talk about it, because they don't want the exposure who Arthur White really was. I mean, he's a complete disaster, and it also vindicates Canright. So, it's a double whammy. Their great biographer of Ellen gets completely sullied and exposed as a fraud, and then Canright comes out for the good person he was, and so this double whammy is really something that they're trying to avoid at all costs. But sooner or later the book's going to get more and more traction. I've been really pleased with how much traction the psychobiography's gotten.
Mm.
But, along with these young guys that I just absolutely loved listening to on your show, I was totally thrilled that you had Brinsmead on, because Brinsmead's a favorite of mine. I even went and visited him at his ranch there, his avocado ranch, when I was in Australia. And, he's he's the person far more than any other that introduced me to the true gospel. And that's something for an Adventist to do that.
Yeah.
Because there's so very few Adventists that even know the true gospel. I saw Ray's comment that the true gospel and Adventism are an oxymoron. And generally speaking, I think that's true. But it was amazing to me when I went back to the seminary and started digging deep into verdict, into present truth. Brinsmead wrote 1844 Reexamined shortly after that, and Judged by the Gospel. So they all came in that package of the 70s. And I have to say that he was by far the most influential Adventist in my life. Of course, he left the church, which you would expect when a person knows the gospel the way he did, because he even knew the gospel way beyond Ford, which is quite interesting, because Ford kind of hung on to the Sabbath. He kind of hung on to the law. But Brinsmead was very, very clear that, the Old Covenant law is out of the picture. And I loved what he said about Cottrell and Neufeld, that way back in the 60s, that these men were saying, the only pre-Advent judgment is the cross of Jesus Christ. Of course, they'd only say that to him. They wouldn't say it openly. They wouldn't say it in public. And that's the whole trouble with Adventism. Even the people that do understand the truth won't speak the truth openly or publicly. They hide under a shell and try to keep their jobs. And, Brinsmead wasn't that way. He was a person who would speak his mind. And there's no question he's been all over the place. He was a perfectionist in the 50s. And then I love the way he talked about a Catholic theologian being the one who brought him to the true gospel of justification by faith. And that was so true in the 60s. You had Vatican II, you had all these Catholics who were more Protestant than the Protestants, and more into Reformation theology than the Protestants. And when I was at Claremont, we had Hans Küng come and speak to us, most famous Catholic theologian in the world. And it was so funny to listen to this guy, because he just completely ridiculed and made fun of the Pope's infallibility the whole time. And of course, he wrote the book Infallible, making fun of it. But it's really interesting to me to see the way Adventism is following after Catholicism. They've been so critical of Catholicism, and yet they're in many ways a replica of Catholicism. Their works orientation, and now they're so pluralistic. Just like Hans Küng, he didn't get kicked out of the church for ridiculing the Pope when he was on our campus. Later he did, he left. But, now you have this kind of pluralism in Adventism, where you have these academics and stuff that don't even believe in God. They don't believe God's a personal being. They certainly don't believe Jesus was God. many of them believe monotheism is evil, the worst form of religion. They've just bought into the hook, line, and sinker of the most liberal theology out there, and yet they don't lose their jobs. It's funny when they brought that stuff onto our campus in the core program. Finally, the board came in and kicked the program out because the students were going insane and it was ridiculous. But they didn't fire those administrators. They all got demoted because they had tenure. So they all went back to their departments and kept teaching the same stuff. It's just that the core program itself was abolished because it was so extremely ridiculous. But Brinsmead is a fascinating guy. When I went and visited him in Australia on his avocado ranch, which is a beautiful place,
Mm.
at that time he was into local politics. He'd kind of gotten out of religion completely, and he was calling himself an atheist or agnostic, and wasn't really into religion much at the time. But I was interested in the interview with him, how he's kind of come back to more of a liberal view, basically saying that Jesus and James were the same, that Jesus never intended to die for the sins of the world, that
Mhm.
Jesus didn't see himself as God. That he said a whole bunch of things in that interview that I found very interesting, and it really sounded to me like he swallowed a lot of the liberal Kool-Aid when it comes to this kind of stuff. But
Yeah, it was a very interesting interview.
yeah,
And this whole season, like you say, a lot of young people have been on it from young people like Mike Colburn right up to Bob Brinsmead. Just in
yeah.
season 9, there's been some fascinating um, conversation.
I
Yeah.
really wished I was on the program with Brinsmead because I would have loved to ask him questions about the things he was saying about the Jews. He acted like, the Gentile church just kicked the Jews out or something, which wasn't the case at all. You had the temple destroyed, you had the persecution of the Jews, they had to flee. It wasn't their fellow Christians that persecuted them, it was the Romans, and it was the culture that was persecuting them. And Brinsmead acted like there was no Jewish presence at the end of the century, but John, the disciple Jesus loved, was there writing his gospel and writing the book of Revelation, and he certainly was a Jewish presence. And so there were a lot of things I wanted to ask him, but obviously I wasn't listening live, so I
He,
didn't have a chance.
a
But
few people have said that they'd like to ask him some questions, and so I have invited him back,
good.
and I'm happy to invite you on as well, yourself, and also maybe Matthew Lucio, the Adventist history podcast. He's had a lot of questions he'd like to ask, so maybe the four of us could unpack some of that stuff, because people have a lot of questions about all his era, his kind of conservative era, perfectionist era, through to his more
Yeah,
liberal era, through to his
it's fast.
agnostic era, through to this current era.
Yeah, totally. It's amazing that such a brilliant person can be all over the place and very dogmatic in whatever, whatever sphere he's focused in. He tends to be very dogmatic about that. And yet these views are so many miles apart when you
Yeah,
look at the different places he's been. But I love the guy. I'll always love the guy because he's the one that introduced the true gospel to me. And, he's the one that made it clear to me that we're not under the law. And, that Adventism is all about the law. It's all about the Sabbath law. It's all about these things that have nothing to do with the true gospel. And what's interesting when you study SDA history is that J.H. Wagner was teaching this exact same stuff. In his book, way back in the early 1850s, he wrote The Law of God, and took that position that Adventists are wrong about the law. We're not under the law. He tried to save the Sabbath, which was really kind of an impossible task given what he was saying about the law. But Wagner's son, um, Wagner's son, when Wagner and Jones preached at the '88 conference, E.J. Wagner, he said the exact same stuff that his father had said back in the 1850s, and his book had been kicked out of the church because of an Ellen White vision. And what was funny was that Smith and Butler, brought that back to Ellen's attention because they were having a major war with Wagner and Jones. And Ellen said, "Yeah, you're right. You're right. Wagner and Jones are wrong, and you guys are right. But I don't want you guys fighting with each other in the church periodicals." So as soon as she recognizes that they're right, they immediately make a big deal of it and said, "Oh, the prophet has endorsed us and condoned what we're saying and condemned what Wagner and Jones are saying." And Ellen was so angry about that she let Wagner and Jones have their say. She saw how popular they were at the conference, and then she decided she was going to switch ships and join in with Wagner and Jones, which completely blew the minds of Butler and Smith.
Yeah.
They were completely fried by that, and really lost all faith in Ellen's visions. Although they couldn't really say that, but that was the reality. But it's interesting that J.H. Wagner had it right way back in the early 50s, and I often wonder, what would have become of Adventism if they hadn't banned Wagner's book and they had actually embraced the true gospel way back in the 1850s. But
what book was
never
that?
know. What's that?
What
The
book
Law
was
of God. It was called The Law of God by J.H. Wagner, and it's online for free. You can read it online. It's a great read. It's just something that most Adventists are completely unaware of. But I did want to say a little bit about Carpenter, Alexander Carpenter's interview. I was interested that he was so forthcoming about being a Richard Rorty fan. I know a lot of Adventist academics are in that place because I saw it with the Corps and all my years in academia. I saw a lot of Adventist academics that were exactly there, but usually they're not willing to admit it, especially when they're the editor of Spectrum. And Rorty, of course, is a total postmodernist. He's 100% relativism. And of course, Carpenter was acknowledging that there is no truth. There is no absolute truth. There is no objective truth. There's just your truth and my truth. And to me, the moment a person buys into that kind of postmodernism, it's almost impossible to reason with them. I've had Walters and Dave Larson coming on to my Facebook page, and I've featured some of their articles recently, and they're into the same thing. That Larson's trying to say, "Oh, Team Ellen." He always talks about Team Ellen. Well, we know she did a bunch of stuff wrong, but Team Ellen accomplished some great things, like they were an actual team working together, which is a complete lie, of course. The way Ellen treated Marion and Fanny was anything but a team. And she wasn't honest with them at all. She hung them out to dry in terms of what they were doing. And once they came to realize more and more what she was doing to them, it drove them nuts. But
literally.
Yeah, I mean, literally. But I see the same thing with Walters, "Oh, there is no truth. It's just your truth and my truth. And everyone has their own subjective truth." And I was quite interested that Carpenter was willing to acknowledge that. But the thing that annoyed me most about his interview was he simply misrepresented the truth where I was concerned. He tried to give the impression that I was this mean, demanding person and that I published emails that I shouldn't have published. And, the truth was that before he even came on board, I contacted Bonnie after Butler wrote his very, very lengthy review of my psychobiography. And I said, it only seems fair that I should be able to respond to this because there are so many things in the review that are completely inaccurate and, just need to be addressed. And her first comment was, well, we just don't have space for you to respond point by point at all. And I said, that's fine. I'm not asking to have an article in the journal. I'm just asking to be able to respond on the website where you have unlimited space. And, but she said, "Oh, we'll print a 300 word thing." Well, Butler's thing was 4,000 words,
Wow.
and you can't respond to 4,000 words in 300 words. It's ridiculous. So, anyway, it was obviously a lie, that they didn't have space because they obviously did have space on their website, and that's all I was asking for. But I knew what was really going on. Guy and Garrity were on the board, and those are two of the most dishonest administrators I've ever known in my life. And they censored my stuff when I was at La Sierra, and so I knew they were really behind it. And once Bonnie stepped down, I told Butler, they won't even let me respond to your review because we're pretty good friends. And he said, well, that's kind of ridiculous. Maybe Carpenter will. He seems a lot more open to Adventist history and stuff than Bonnie. So I contacted him, and I said the same thing. I'm not asking for even an article in the magazine. I'm just asking that I could have space on the website to respond to a very lengthy and in many ways very, very inaccurate book review. And he hemmed and hawed around, did the same kind of dance, and then I said, I've had several people on my thread say they're really amazed that Spectrums lacks the journalistic integrity to let an author respond to a book review of his own book. And oh, are you saying I don't have integrity? Are you threatening me? He tries to make it sound like it's a threat or something. And he was completely misrepresenting me and what I said. And so I said, if you're going to misrepresent me and lie about me, I'm going to publish the email so people can see the truth for themselves. And I don't need any lessons about integrity from someone who is so lacking in journalistic integrity that they won't even allow an author to respond to a book review about his own book, even on a website, So we weren't exactly on good terms after that. But I'm annoyed by the way people like him misrepresent me and try to make it sound like I'm some big bully or something when it's anything but the case.
When you mentioned that you and John Butler are friends, did you have a chance to say to him, why did you print so many errors about my work? You should know
Yeah,
better.
I sent Butler my response, and it point for point went through every single thing he said. I also published my response to Butler's review and as one of the appendixes in the White Estate Fraud. And I did the same thing to Tim from the White Estate because neither the White Estate nor Spectrum would allow me to respond. So I prefaced both of my responses with, because the White Estate would not allow me to respond, because Spectrum would not allow me to respond, I think it's only fair that the reader know my response to these reviews. And I just point by point pick them apart. And, Butler's I think Butler's in a real awkward. He's been writing a book his entire
I
life,
know. I can't.
40 years, And even when we were teaching together at La Sierra, I kept saying, "Hey, when's your book coming out, man?
Yeah, yeah,
I want to see this thing." And it just gets dragged out forever and ever and ever and ever. And I don't know if he's really seriously planning on publishing it.
yeah,
But if he is, I think what happened with my psychobiography is it really threw a wrench in the works for him.
right.
It really brings up a bunch of issues and stuff that haven't been brought up the same way by anyone else. And now with Canwright being vindicated, that even makes things a lot tougher for Adventist apologists. And I
Yeah.
don't think Butler's an apologist by any means. He's not even Adventist, I don't believe, by any means. But he is trying to make his name and I won't say his fortune, but his name and his academic reputation off this Ellen White book. And, I think it's really set him back that I wrote these two books that, don't really fit with the narrative he was trying to produce about Ellen White and stuff. So I think that's why he wrote the review, because he was trying to attempt to discredit my book. But when I wrote my response, I mean, it discredited every single point that he made. So I don't think he came out.
When I interviewed he and Ron Numbers years ago now, I guess, and sad that Ron Numbers has left the planet. I was hoping to interview him again before he passed, but when I interviewed John and Ron, Ron Butler was paying him out for, when's this book coming out you keep talking about?
Numbers was, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Numbers was pretty prolific, and Butler, he just never gets it done.
I wonder if he will, or because I mean, obviously he's got a manuscript there that he's been working on.
Yeah, the rumors were going around that he was going to finish, Numbers book on Kellogg. But when I asked him about it, he said, "No, those are false rumors." And
right.
He tried to
Ron had a book that wasn't complete when he passed.
Right. Yeah, he got paid $10,000 to write a book on Kellogg, which we were all really looking forward to. But his health basically deserted him, and I don't know how much of it he actually got done. But Butler would have been the logical person to pick it up and finish the work. But for whatever reason, I guess what he told me was, hey, I got my hands way too full with my own undertaking, much less taking on Numbers' unfinished work. So,
yeah.
But that makes sense. That
yeah. Have you heard of Dr. Rick Foray? He's a friend of mine, lives around here. He's written a book called Seventh-day Adventist Health Reform, The Crucible of Identity Tensions, Ellen G. White and Dr. John H. Kellogg, The Battle for Seventh-day Adventist Identity. And
no, I haven't seen it. I'd like to check it.
Yeah, I can send you the link, but he strikes me as someone that would be really good at, if there's anyone watching that's got anything to do with Ron Numbers.
Does he add quite a bit to what Numbers did?
I'm not sure if he adds to it, but he certainly understands the whole realm of what was going on during that time period. And I think, he'd be a perfect person to take the baton and perhaps run with it. I think he's written 2 books on it.
Yeah, the book I'm writing right now is called Leaving Adventism, Why I Left, Why So Many Have Left, and Why So Many More Are Leaving. And, one of the chapters I'm working on right now is the Adventist Exodus. Why, why there are these increasing numbers, and more the church is being honest about, some are being honest that, hey, the numbers the church advertises have nothing to do with reality. I mean, zero. Even Ty Gibson,
that was an interesting interview.
Million, he's saying, well, the real number is only a quarter of what they claim.
Yeah,
and that's their own guy. But I really enjoyed your interview with James White. And I found it really ironic that his name is James White. He goes by Jim.
Yeah.
It's almost hard to find his name, when you look on his sites, Defeating Adventism and all these different, his name isn't there. You have to kind of do some research, and he's got this apologia, and he's an academic, and
he has another last name as well that he uses, so that confuses it even more.
Oh, is it different than White?
Yeah. So
James White is the name that I found, but what's his other name that he goes by?
I think it's Baber.
Beba.
He might be watching right now, and I'd be embarrassed if I got that wrong because I've had him on the show a few times.
Interesting. Well, James White is the name I
I've got to
found
check
for
that.
him, so,
Yeah,
that
me
cracked
too.
me up, here
Yeah.
here's another James
I
White only who tells the truth about Adventism.
And he had never met Adventists until
Yeah, yeah,
recent
I
years.
mean, I love his,
He's
research and stuff,
incredible. Oh,
but he's done amazing research, I looked at every one of his, different, defeating Adventisms that had to do with finances, number
yeah,
9, 138, 139, 139A. He did a lot of great research and he used the Adventist numbers themselves, which I
yeah,
was really impressed with. That, even if you just use their own numbers, which doesn't even come close to including all the people who've left but are still on the books, it doesn't even count those people. But if you just use their own numbers and then add in the deaths that they don't count,
yeah,
uh, it's almost 80%, 76 to 78%
yeah,
are mass exodus. I mean, it's it makes the Mormons look like they don't have any recidivism at all.
yeah,
I did some comparative research, and the Pew Research Institute says 75% of Mormons stay in the church. They only have like a 25% of fallout rate. And no matter, even if you look at the most damning, if you will, studies, that says 65% stay in the church in rural areas and 71% continue to attend church on a regular basis in urban areas, which, that makes Adventism look like a joke. But
yeah. I mean, Adventists. That, by the way, though, if people want to go and check out Jim's research, just Academy Apologia, the
mhm.
YouTube channel, and just type in, Academy Apologia and Adventist statistics or something like that.
Or if
And
they just put in defeating Adventism
that's it.
139,
Oh, thank you.
that's probably the best one.
Yeah, I'm
I mean,
glad you've
all of
got
them are
that.
good. He
Yeah,
has
yeah,
9, 138, 139, 139A. They're all good,
yeah.
but the 139 is the one that
That
does
I'm
the
glad
biggest.
you remembered the number because it's a really, really interesting interview. I mean, a really interesting commentary on the stats that had come out by what's the guy Trim? Is it
Yeah, yeah,
David Trim?
right. And
Uh,
he tries to put an Adventist spin on
Spin
everything,
on
but
it, yeah. But it seems like according to Jim's analysis of it, that it could be even more than 50% of Adventists are actually leaving the church.
oh,
Uh,
it's way more.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think he was
I
saying
mean,
maybe 65% or something.
if you add in, well, what he's saying is it's 76 to 78% by their own statistics. But
Right, wow.
if you add in all the people that are still on the books who've tried to get their names off the books or who've never
Yes,
bothered, those people aren't even counted in those figures. So
interesting.
you're talking about 80 to 90%
Yeah.
leaving. I mean,
And most Adventists I know that say they are former Adventist still haven't taken their name off the
right,
roll. You're right,
precisely.
yes, even more. And the guy Trim said that I think since the 1960s, there's been 46 million people leave the Adventist church. That
Yeah, yeah, all those numbers, and since the 70s, 75% dropping per capita tithe. I mean, the church is in huge trouble even by their own numbers. And so, I think with all these young people coming up, holding them accountable, their days are numbered. You
have
can
you
only
been
fool.
following, the Conrad Vine stuff?
Yeah, I read quite a bit on it today because it came up on my thread.
Yeah, what are your
And
thoughts?
he's the president, I guess, of Frontier Missions, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
think
mean,
so.
is that considered self-supporting?
I think so. Yeah, I think
Yeah,
he
so
has
he can't
worked
really.
officially for the church, but I don't think he,
It's kind of like ADRA or something, right?
yeah,
It's it. it's considered Adventist, but it's independent. And obviously he's untouchable because, they're not allowing him to preach in the churches, but
Yeah.
they can't take his membership or kick him out of the church, which, that really makes a big difference.
Yeah.
I often say that the reason I lasted as long as I did in Adventism is because I was in a position where I was very hard to fire. A
Yeah.
campus chaplain is hired by the conference, but you work for the university president, the VP, the religion dean, the dean of students, or VP for student life. So you have all these semi bosses that you answer to, but none of them are really your bosses. None of them can fire you. And I'm sure there were many that wanted to fire me over the years, but they didn't have the position or power. Even Garrity couldn't fire me. It
Mm.
wasn't until Mallory, who'd been on the campus for years, became the conference president, that they were able to collude and kind of plot against me, type thing.
Mm.
But yeah, your position is going to have a huge influence. If you're just a person that can easily be picked off, they'll pick you off,
Mm.
like they did with Ford. But if you're
Yeah.
in a position where it's very difficult to get at you, like it sounds like is the case with Vine,
Yeah.
he's taking full advantage of it, and I'm glad he is. I don't know exactly where he stands on the gospel, but I certainly like what I've read about the remnant and all the other things that he's blowing away. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think he is going to have a massive impact if he and his followers and supporters follow through with some of their ideas of offering tithe to churches that instead of to the conference or to the church they're at, sending it to churches that they feel aligned with. That's going to
yeah,
really
I
shift.
mean, it's really interesting to think what the church is going to try to do about that, because they
Yeah.
can't stand anyone who's a
Yes.
president or who's in a high position bucking the party line.
Yeah.
That's
Once you start
something
talking about
different.
the money,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, money is what rocks the boat. But
can I just shift gears a little bit? Moto Sapien asked a question a while back I want to bring up on the screen, and then I do want to talk about some Ellen White stuff. But this one, often this kind of question comes up a lot for Adventists, if they're fringe Adventists or currently Adventists or gospel Adventists. They're trying to work out, or if you're doing away with the law, is it not important? And I think what you were saying before is not doing away with the law, but you're not under the law, and there's a difference there.
absolutely.
But he
I
asked,
mean,
I'll just read out the question. He asked Dr. Daly, in your position saying that the law is done away with, why do you think there was a law at all? The age-old question, why then the law?
yeah, I mean, what Adventists have is a complete misunderstanding of the covenants. They don't understand the covenants. They don't understand what the law is in Scripture. They don't understand that when David talks about the law, he's not talking about the old covenant law. He's talking about the everlasting covenant. And the everlasting covenant was from the very beginning. Every time God made a covenant with any individual, whether it was Abraham or Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right down the line, every single covenant he made, the Davidic covenant, et cetera, these were all expressions of the everlasting covenant. The only covenant that was temporary, the only covenant that was imperfect, was the Mosaic covenant, the Sinai covenant given at Sinai. And
Mm.
that wasn't God's perfect will. That wasn't his desire. In Exodus 19:5-6, he said to Moses, I want the Israelites to be a priesthood, a royal priesthood. I want them to be a priesthood of all believers. He wanted them to have intimacy with him and enter into a heart religion with him like David did. That was his desire. And the people said, no, we don't want anything to do with that, Moses. We'll listen to you, but you be the go-between between us and God. We're afraid of God. And, they're coming out of slavery for 400 plus years. So it's not terribly hard to understand why they were so spiritually immature. But It was an imperfect covenant from the beginning. And yet Adventists have idolized this covenant and made it into something it was never intended to be. It was simply for the Jews. It was simply to be temporary. It was simply to be a schoolmaster that led them to Christ, pointed them to Christ. The Messiah would fill all things. Um, so it's the old covenant that has no basis and standing today. And you might say, well, what about the Ten Commandments? Aren't those still good principles? Sure, they're good principles. You can find those same principles in the everlasting covenant, both before Sinai and in the New Testament after Sinai. So there's nothing that Sinai adds to the principles of the kingdom of God. We don't need the old covenant law to believe in the principles of God's kingdom. That's nonsense. And you know what Adventists don't seem to understand is that the old covenant, including the Ten Commandments, are a covenant of condemnation. The Bible makes that very clear. 2 Corinthians 3, 7, and 9. The law written on stone by the finger of God, it's unmistakably talking about the Ten Commandments, is a ministry of death and condemnation. It couldn't be any more clear. Those are the verses that led me out of Adventism way back in the 80s, as far as my understanding of the gospel. And even in the 70s with Brinsmead, I was understanding that. And so, the only reason that Adventists cling to the Ten Commandments is the Sabbath. They're Sabbath idolaters. And the Sabbath isn't in effect for God's people today. It was for the Jews. And this notion that, Adventists always say, hey, but what about creation? Well, true. The Sabbath had a purpose and role in creation. And I don't deny that. What God has blessed is blessed. So the Sabbath was blessed at creation. I have no problem with that. I believe there's a Sabbath blessing to be had if people want that. But it has nothing to do with obligation. It has nothing to do with having to worship on the seventh day. It has nothing to do with the old covenant law. It has nothing to do with the fourth commandment. All this stuff is Adventist invention to glorify themselves, to try to make people think they're the remnant. They have the truth. It's self-delusion, and it's self-worship and self-idolatry. And so, when you look at the everlasting covenant, it's the law that God has always had in place, everlasting. He was the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. All things were together in Christ from the very beginning. And everything about God's law points forward to Christ in the Old Testament, backward to Christ in the New Testament. And, when David says, your law is everlasting, he's not talking about the old covenant, because it wasn't. It was a temporal covenant. He's talking about the everlasting covenant. When he says the law of the Lord is perfect, he's not talking about the old covenant, because it wasn't perfect. It was imperfect. Hebrews says it's imperfect. He's talking about the everlasting covenant, which is perfect. And so Adventists, they have their agenda where they have to try to redeem this old covenant Ten Commandment law for their own self-worship, for their own remnancy, for their own Sabbath idolatry. But none of it is legitimate. None of it's biblical. It was all done away with at the cross. And because Adventists don't believe that, they undermine the perfect finished work of the cross and the perfect finished work of Christ all the time. I have to deal with Adventist apologists every day who are against the perfect finished work of Christ because it's all about them. It's all about Adventists. Oh, we're the ones that have to perfect ourselves so Christ can return. That's such nonsense and stupidity that it's really troubling. I hope that helps.
Yeah. I'd be interested what
Adventists
Motor Sapien thinks about that.
Yeah, Adventists don't understand the covenants. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
And if you understand what the everlasting covenant is, it's also called the law of liberty. It's It's contrasted with the law of sin and death in Romans 8:1 and 2. The law of sin and death is the old covenant.
Mm,
The law of the Spirit is the same as the law of liberty. Um, it's the everlasting covenant. It's only called the new covenant because Jesus revealed the everlasting covenant perfectly for the first time.
mm,
That's why it's new,
mm,
because Jesus revealed the everlasting covenant perfectly for the first time in history. But the new covenant is nothing more than Jesus revealing God's everlasting covenant.
mm, mm. And that's quite a significant thing to understand, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's amazing that Adventists don't seem to be even broaching the topic.
Yeah, they just don't have a clue when it comes to the gospel, and that's sad, because the gospel is the center of what Scripture is about.
Mm. It's so obviously reverse engineered from 1844 back. They just desperately don't want to let go of 1844, and so they have to kind of proof text their way back to the gospel and make it work.
Yeah, they're asking me how would I define the perfect finished work of Christ. Christ himself said, "It is finished," when he died on the cross. Um, John 12:31, when I am lifted up, I will draw all to me. And what does he say? Um, that the prince of this world, it's very interesting that he calls him a prince before he's crucified, but he's cast down and no longer a prince after the cross. That's very important to understand. The cross is all about the authority of Jesus Christ. All authority has now been given to me. Okay, what
Mm,
does that mean? It means the devil had some legitimate authority before the cross
mhm,
because of sin. Because of sin, the devil had some legitimate authority on the earth. Jesus referred to him as a prince, but not after the cross.
that's
He's
right.
never a prince again. He's nobody. He's got no authority. He's got no
Mm,
power over God's people
mm,
after the cross. And so it's understanding, when Colossians 2 says that he nailed um, our sins to the cross and the condemnation of those sins. If you don't nail that to the cross, you're still under that condemnation. When
mm,
you function in religion under law, you're basically giving the devil permission to condemn you.
mm. You're
That's
giving
what a
him
law.
authority
Yeah, you're giving
right
him
up until the
authority.
time of trouble pre-Jesus returning. You're giving him that authority, and only then can
Absolutely.
you vindicate God. It totally does
Absolutely.
away with the atonement at the
I
cross.
mean, it's such a disaster when you think of it in practical terms
Yeah.
to not understand. And Adventists always say, "Oh, well, he's doing intercession. What do you mean his work is finished?" Obviously, the work of salvation was finished, and the overcoming of sin and the condemnation of sin was done away with. That's what was finished. All legitimate authority that the devil had was done away with. It
Mm,
no longer exists.
mm,
And Christians need to understand this if they're to live a victorious Christian life. Adventists always talk about living a victorious Christian life without the ability to do it because
mm,
they put themselves under law, which is
mm,
under condemnation, which is why they're so confused, which is why so many of them are afraid to think they're saved. It's all Ellen White legalism that,
mm,
you know, goes back to the cultic stuff of Adventism
mm.
that is so tragic. James White couldn't have come out of a more legalistic, perfectionistic, messed up movement than the Christian Connection.
Yeah.
They were a big cult themselves.
Mm,
And if we have
mm,
time tonight, I want to talk about
mm.
7 layers of pathology, even before Ellen White became the quotes prophet of Sabbatarian Adventism.
Oh,
Uh,
I'd love to do that. Yeah.
yeah, let me know if you
Yeah.
want
Well,
to transition to that.
let's do a couple of brief things, and then we'll have a break, and then we'll come back and let's just spend the rest of the time talking about that.
Okay.
the Christian Connection, because was Joseph Bates involved with that too?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I thought
James and
so.
Joseph Bates both came out of the
Yeah,
Christian Connection,
and
which was
essentially,
anti-Trinitarian. They didn't have any healthy Christology. They didn't believe Jesus was God. They were grossly perfectionistic and legalistic. They
mm,
were just plain a cult.
mm,
And Ellen was involved in all these cults too before she came into the cult of Adventism. So
yeah,
it's really a cult fest when you look at where these people came
yeah.
from. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
Ray writes, Steve, do you ever get sick and tired of thinking about Adventism?
You know, my life has been so much happier the last 14 years since I've been out of Adventism that it brings me joy to help people make the same transition. You know,
Mm,
I
mm,
want to see people get freed. I want to see people, and I see it every day on my thread. You know, there's all kinds of people that are thanking me for doing what I'm doing. And it's very
mm,
rewarding to have people experiencing freedom, getting out from under religion under law, religion under condemnation, religion under a false prophet, religion under a cult, and breathing the fresh air of the gospel of Jesus Christ and
mm,
coming to understand that for the first time in their lives.
mm,
Just like it was so exciting to me when I found out in the 1970s from Brinsmead the true gospel.
mm,
He put me on to, David Lloyd Jones and all his books on, Romans and Galatians. And it was just such a love fest for me
mm,
to be able to get into the true gospel when I'd been in Adventism all my life. It was like,
mm.
wow, this is unbelievably awesome. But
Kay, I'm just going to read a comment from Kay Judge over there on Facebook. I can't bring the Facebook comments onto the screen, unfortunately, the way Facebook has changed some of their policies. So I'll just read it out. But Kay and I often have these disagreements where I'm assessing Adventism the same way you are.
mhm.
And she says, but not all Adventists are like that. Well, I'm not saying that not all Adventists are like that. And like you said, you even found through the writings of Bob Brinsmead in Verdict magazine, through that era, you
Yeah,
found the gospel from an Adventist.
amen.
So no one's saying that can't be done. But she writes, many Adventists believe that Christ completed salvation for all at the cross. Many worship on Sabbath as a reminder of what Christ did as creator, savior, redeemer, and friend. They don't worship on Sabbath as a commandment for salvation, but add a celebration of salvation and redemption and Christ's ongoing creation in the world. And I think that's great, Kay. And
Yeah,
and I know Steve would agree. But I
amen.
think what we're saying is that the major thrust of Adventism is not that kind of Adventism. And I think,
Right,
Kay, you said yesterday that I've come to some interesting conclusions and assessments. I, I'm not saying that it cannot be found. I don't think Steve's saying that,
right.
but the vast majority of Adventist source material, as Miles Christian points out, Ellen White's teachings, the Great
Yes.
Controversy, does point to a legalistic kind of Adventism that fails to understand the true gospel and of what the atonement means. How would you answer her in a more kind of articulate way than me? um,
Well, we see what's happening to Conrad Vine. He's being banned from the churches because he's preaching a form of Adventism that is not sanctioned by official Adventism. And that's very threatening to the church. And of course, if a person just wants to sit at home and believe what they want to believe and not rock the boat and not confront official Adventism or the party line, then the church isn't going to look them up and try to kick them out. If
mm,
you're an employee like I was, then you're going to be in trouble a lot, like I was. If I didn't have more liberal people protecting me, I would have been kicked out way, 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 way earlier.
mm,
And it's what you have to do. To me, if you know the true gospel, I don't believe in sitting on it and acting like I'm going along with an official Adventism when I know it's wrong. You know, I
mm,
I felt that I had to preach and teach what I believed and let the chips fall where they may. So I was in hot water all the time for doing this. If you're a lay person, maybe you work as a nurse or something, and you're not confronted with this kind of stuff all the time.
Mm.
But you still have to ask the question, why do I want to be in a subculture that has the gospel wrong and officially has it wrong and gets very threatened if you pop your head up and start talking about the true gospel?
Mm.
Why do you want to be in that kind of a subculture? Those are
Yeah,
good questions.
yeah, and I think particularly if your movement, denomination, religion is claiming to be a very special, unique remnant,
Right.
then that message has got to come across clearly. And I think Adventism, as presented by Ted Wilson, is coming across very clear. So if you're in that church and you have a better understanding of it, like Kay does, um, uh, that that's good. But it doesn't mean that the church would back you on that. Like you say, you can be in more of a lay position, and they don't care. But the
Yeah,
reality is the church doesn't teach that the atonement was all done at the cross. Uh,
absolutely.
Eugene Hallett writes, K, SDA teaching is that salvation is not completed at the cross.
Absolutely.
And so, Kay, you might feel that it was great, but that's not what your church officially teaches.
Correct. It's definitely the case.
Test the Prophet, great YouTube channel, by the way. Everyone go. You would have seen Test the Prophet's work on YouTube, I'm sure, Steve. But
Yes, I am.
incredible work. Go and check out the channel, Test the Prophet. He asks, do you think Ellen decided to be a prophet out of an emotional response to the great disappointment and then kept the charade going because she was too deep in it?
Yeah, I'll answer that very specifically when we look at these 7 layers of pathology.
Okay, yeah, we'll
We'll
come to that.
definitely go over that in detail.
Okay, well, before we get to that, I had a couple of quick questions. I'll bring this up onto the screen. Because I didn't know how much this guy kind of had an impact. This is Don McAdams.
Yes, yes.
And I didn't realize in our previous interviews how much of an influence he had on this kind of topic of Ellen White and plagiarism and this
Mhm.
kind of thing. Even preceding Walter Ray, he was writing
Yes,
material about it, but was obviously a bit cautious. And
right.
he'd written this book on it. And recently he did an incredible video where he talked about his he was at some kind of afternoon meeting and he just shared his journey and thoughts on the book. And so I wanted to ask you, did you know him in the academic scholarly realms? Have you read this book? What are your thoughts
Yes, yes,
on
I've
it?
read the book, and Harvey Bernice, he was on my thread a lot. He worked
That's
closely
right.
with McAdams and stuff, and so I
Mm,
heard a lot about McAdams' work from him as well. And um, obviously McAdams was one of those who had a lot of ties to Adventism, and he wasn't ready to publish that stuff way back when it could have been published. And I don't try to judge people like that. Someone say, I didn't know you'd only been out of the church for 14 years, but I mean, the truth is, I was ready to leave Adventism in 1980. First of all, in the late 70s when Ford left, I was a strongly even more of a Fordite than Ford because of Brinsmead. Um, but I got called to La Sierra right at that time, and it was a really almost miraculous thing that someone as young as me got called to this position. And I prayed about it a lot, and God just convicted me. Hey, I'm putting you there for a purpose. Try to make the best of it that you can. And then I started getting involved with the Vineyard in '85, and was ready to leave again because the Vineyard seemed so much more authentic in terms of Christianity than what Adventism was. But again, I talked to Wimber. prayed about it. God convicted me. Stay in till they kick you out. Um, Try to, and I think my Adventism for a New Generation book really did have a very wide influence in the church. And I don't regret staying in, but the problem is that Adventism is so political, especially in university settings. You're just bombarded with politics all the time. And the Adventist churches are divided, there's always infighting. I've had 14 years now of absolute peace. I love our little church. People love each
Mm.
other. There's no rumor mongering and gossip and
Mm.
backbiting and division. And I mean, it's just like a wonderful joy to be in a church like this after being in Adventist churches for 35 years. So, I wanted to do what God was calling me to do. But as far as enjoying it, I enjoy it so much more since I've been out
Yeah.
because you don't have the condemnation and the backbiting and all the stuff that comes with religion under law.
Mm.
And under law is a bad recipe.
Mm. Mm.
And Adventism has that divisiveness and anger and systems that are backbiting and always telling on each other and reporting to the conference and all this kind of, pathological stuff going on.
Kay replied to your answer and my comments. She said, then we get into semantics about what the church is. When I said it, her view isn't what the official statement is. I found the experience of full salvation in Christ through Adventism. So I think Adventism is much more nuanced today.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that there are Adventists just like what I got exposed to with Brinsmead, and then of course Ford. He led a lot of people in a very Christ-centered direction, and the gross legalism and perfectionism of Adventism is certainly not what it's been in the past. If you want to look at the dark ages of Adventism, they're from 1920 to 1950. Those are really the dark ages. But then, with
Mm.
after the 50s, it starts moving back into a lot of legalism. But, once you get into the 80s and 90s and into the new century, Adventism's become ridiculously pluralistic. That's the point I try to make. You have Adventists that don't believe God exists. You have Adventists that don't believe Jesus was God. You have Adventists who believe that monotheism is evil. Um, you have all kinds of Adventists that are all over the place, and that's one reason the church is crumbling because it doesn't stand for anything anymore, and they're trying to hold it together. But at least when they were all on a conservative wavelength for the most part, there was a little more unity. But now they're just playing all over the place, postmodernism and you name it. It's pretty much anything goes as long as you don't talk about the gospel or the Holy Spirit too much. Then you'll get booted. But but you can be a postmodernist and not
Yeah.
believe in God. And like Fritz Guy, I'm a post-Christian. I don't believe in Christianity, but I'm an Adventist.
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's that kind of stuff that's pretty ridiculous when you stop and think about it.
She adds, I agree the politics is rife in Adventism and in all religions. It takes courage to confront ideas that reduce Christ's intentions for us. Most religions are going through deconstructionism. That is part of postmodernism.
Yeah. Yeah, this whole modern age, it's very interesting to see how academics teach their students now compared to how they used to do, how journalism operates. I mean, there's so many things that have dramatically changed in our world that, I think this younger generation's often raised to say, oh, you know way more than any past generation or your parents because you have a cell phone, but they don't know what questions to ask their cell phone if they don't have the background and wisdom and perspective. They don't understand, somebody's programming AI.
Mm.
There's all these mistakes in AI because they're programmed a certain way. But if you
Mm,
don't have the background to understand, you won't know that they're mistakes. You won't know
mm.
that misprogramming it. And
Mistakes and bias as well. They've got biases in
absolutely.
there. Incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, it's Michael Walsh has a new book out, against the corporate media, and it's a book that every single person who lives in a democratic society should read because it
Mm,
shows the dramatic change in journalism over the last 4, 5 decades, and
mm,
it is dramatic. I mean, it's
mm,
something that most people aren't aware of,
mm.
but um,
It's just
it's
propaganda now.
yeah, I mean,
Mm,
absolutely.
yeah.
It's just people take their sides and then they try to push their agenda, and it's nothing to do with true journalism, just like academia has nothing to do with true research and study anymore. It's an agenda that's being pushed on students, and
Mm,
that's really tragic. I had some great teachers coming up over the years, and they were always about, hey, these are the options out there, study them for yourselves and make up your own mind.
mm,
That's how it used to be. That's what good education was. No more. Now
mm,
you've got
mm.
agenda-driven stuff that's
Yeah.
absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned, I think, in an interview I did with you a long time ago, about your book, the Ellen G. White, a psychobiography, that an
Yes.
Australian guy had hacked a lot of material, and kind of you stumbled across it and were able to use that in your book. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
'Cause
yeah.
I'm,
Well,
'cause I'm
I
pretty
had
sure
kinda
he's watching right now, and
Oh,
he and I are
cool.
going to do a show on that hacking in a few weeks.
Oh, really? I'd
Yeah,
love to hear that one live. What's
yes.
the date gonna be?
So he's watching now. So hopefully this time, not next week, the week after. But
Yeah, if it
yeah.
wasn't for him, I wouldn't have written the psychobiography because I'd left Adventism in 20 2010, had no intention
Mm,
of looking back. I'd written all the books about Adventism I was gonna write, and
mm,
then I found out about the hacking. I found out about information that had been withheld from me as a researcher, got my curiosity going again. I find out about Ellen White being a drunkard, you
yeah.
know, her vinegar, alcohol, obsessions, and just a lot of things that had been withheld from me,
Interesting.
as a
He,
researcher.
he's just written, actually, so I don't think he minds me saying his name. Brendan Paul Valiant. He said, "Let's do October 22."
That's good, that's good. I hope it's not when I'm on a
Uh,
cruise, it might be, but
oh yeah. Well,
if
October
it
22 is a Sunday, so we might not be able to do that. But oh no, it's not. October 22 is a Monday your time, Tuesday our time. But we might be able to do it a couple of days after that anyway.
yeah,
So yeah.
that's one I'd love to hear live.
Yes. Oh,
I'd
that
love
would
to
be
hear the
fantastic.
details.
Yeah.
Didn't he get all sued and all kinds of weird stuff by the
Yep. There was
denomination?
all sorts of stuff that he eventually was able to resolve and settle out of court, I think.
Good,
I might be wrong, but Brendan will clarify all of that in a few weeks' time.
good.
Um,
It'll be fun to listen to.
yeah, so I'll definitely let you know about that one. Okay, before our break, I just wanted you to just briefly chat on two things. Um, Ellen Ellen's twin sister, Elizabeth.
Right.
Do you know much about her? Did she ever have letters that we can access to learn a bit about
Yeah, I
her
mean, Ellen wrote her
personality?
letter. She just wasn't on the same wavelength as Ellen at all. And when I go into these 7 levels of pathology, I'll talk about some how different Elizabeth was and really all the rest of Ellen's siblings. Ellen has this very unique pathology that surfaces in various forms that is completely counter to her siblings, her family, the Methodism. It wasn't completely counter to the shouting Methodism. And I have one guy on my thread who's always saying, "Well, you can't differentiate shouting Methodism from Methodism." And there's a sense in which that's true, that most of the Methodist churches at least had a strain of shouting Methodism in them, but it was the shouting Methodist camp meetings that were complete fanaticism and that were completely crazy. And this is where Ellen White got baptized.
Mhm.
And the shouting Methodism that she was heavily involved in was absolutely nothing like the Methodist church that her and her parents belonged to and that she got kicked out of. And people have to understand this, that these levels of pathology are extremely fascinating where Ellen's concerned. And one of the things I'm doing in this Leaving Adventism book is I'm digging down deeper into several areas that I didn't go into in either the psychobiography or the White Estate Fraud that are some of the most controversial issues. Ellen's involvement with the occult, the demonic, sexual pathology, the lesbian connection, all these kinds of weird things that I didn't really touch in the psychobiography because I knew it was controversial enough without bringing that stuff
Mm,
in.
mm. But
But
you'll be talking about it in your new book.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
we've already been discussing some of it on the thread, but I still have about 5 chapters to go before I'm done.
Yeah, so, if people wanted to research that, there's letters there that they can find between
Yeah, I mean,
so
we
they're trying
just
to get a sense of what she was like, I guess.
we have almost no material about her compared to Ellen, of course.
Yeah.
And really the little that we have about her is Ellen related. It's Ellen writing her a letter trying to convert her, and she wants nothing to do with it. And she was the only one who wasn't disfellowshipped from the Methodist Church. All the rest of the family was disfellowshipped, but she stayed in.
Right.
She was I'd say a fairly nominal Methodist her whole life. She was a loyal Methodist, but she certainly wasn't an avid religious person she was just a much more nominal personality where religion was concerned. And she wasn't at all inclined to buy into Ellen's stuff for good reason. I think she had some great discernment there. It's
Mm.
really interesting to think about how she was affected by the rock incident.
Yeah.
And even the rock incident, you really have to ask the question, this isn't an enemy of Ellen White that throws a rock at her. It's a friend of Ellen White's. What did Ellen do that so pissed this girl off that she throws a big boulder at her head? I mean, that's not normal 9-year-old behavior for women, especially. And so there's a lot to unpack. And that's why I look at these 7 layers of pathology, because I think when you unpack these 7 layers, then it becomes much more easy to understand who Ellen White was in the context of Adventism, which is
Mhm.
also very pathological. But
Mm.
it's the 7 layers of pathology that give us the insight into the pathology that Ellen has in Adventism throughout her life.
Mm. Oh, this will be very interesting then. We'll chat about that after the break. 2 quick things, and we could probably do a whole show on this one, but about, Anna Rice Phillips.
Yes,
I think while Ellen White was in Australia, um, this
right,
lady began having prophetic dreams and visions and sharing
right.
them, and took a fair bit of began to have a big influence on the
Yes,
church.
big
And I
following, Prescott, a lot of the
yeah,
bigwigs
and
were very impressed by her, A.T. Jones.
yeah, I
She
was
had
just
a lot of
reading,
people that thought,
I was just reading this morning that it was on a Sabbath morning in the middle of April, 1894, that Elder A.T. Jones, in the Dime Tabernacle, which seated 4,000 people, presented Anna Phillips' testimonies as a
yeah,
genuine manifestation of the spirit of prophecy.
amen.
Can you share a little bit of some information about Anna
Yeah,
Rice and how she
I
was
mean,
dealt with?
I would preface it by saying that Adventists know very little about prophecy. They don't understand prophecy any more than they understand the covenants. They don't understand the difference between Old Testament prophecy and New Testament prophecy, particularly. Wayne Grudem has one of the best books on this prophecy in the New Testament and today. He's a systematic theologian. It's a phenomenal book. But Adventists don't comprehend any of this stuff at all. And they treat Ellen like an Old Testament prophet, which is absolute nonsense. She doesn't even measure up to a New Testament prophet or post-New Testament prophet, but she certainly doesn't even come close to an Old Testament prophet. But anyway, my own experience with prophecy and the gifts expanded dramatically and greatly after I started attending the Vineyard in '85. And, growing up Adventist, it was my inclination to be very judgmental of this stuff, as Adventists are trained and taught to be. It's all of the devil, all this weird stuff. And the thing God just impressed on me over and over and over again, knowing he was going to expose me to all kinds of stuff, was withhold judgment, withhold judgment, withhold judgment. Just observe, try to analyze, try to understand, withhold judgment. So, I saw all kinds of stuff, healthy and unhealthy, where prophecy and the gifts were concerned. But my own, my own perspective from all my studies and experiences is that Anna Rice Phillips was a legitimate post-New Testament prophet. I think she fits with the New Testament test. And there are three different types of prophecy in the New Testament. There's a general gift. Paul talks about 1 Corinthians 14. I would that all of you would prophesy. So there's a general gift where anyone can prophesy in the church. Then there's the specific gift, Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12. And that's the person that's more mature and more typically accurate in their prophetic words. And then you've got the office of the prophet, Ephesians 4, which is the most mature. These are typically people who have a wide spectrum of acceptance that's interdenominational. A John Wimber kind of person himself, I believe, fit with the office of a prophet. Mm-hmm. But those people are much more rare. Even the gifting of prophecy in the Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12 context is relatively rare. But, the fact that anyone can be given a prophetic word, that's obviously much more general. But a church has to believe in it. God doesn't impose that on people. So Adventists don't have it because they don't believe in it. They're condemning of it and they're closed to it. And they don't understand the spirit or the gifts. But, Anna Rice Phillips really fits with the 1 Corinthians 14:3. That prophecy is to be edifying, uplifting, building up, encouraging. She was a very encouraging person, just the opposite of Ellen White, who was condemning everyone who didn't, agree with her or who dared to question her in any way, shape, or form. Ellen was filled with condemnation, whereas Anna Rice Phillips wasn't that way at all. And she was a very demurring person. When Ellen came back and lashed out at her, she just submitted and was glad to become a Bible worker and didn't try to challenge. She didn't want all the attention, and she had a humble spirit. She wasn't like Ellen.
Did she write are there any books or articles, or is there anything in writing we can
prophecies from her day and stuff, but I don't have like any actual written materials of her. Everything I have about her was just what was said by Jones and
said
Prescott.
about her, not what she actually said.
Right. But,
I'd love
based
to
on
find
what
out
was said about her,
Mm.
I do believe that she was a very humble, gifted person who was much more like a post-New Testament prophet than anything Ellen White was. So I have much higher respect for Anna Rice Phillips than I do for Ellen White.
I'd love to research her a bit more and see if we can dig up some of her actual writings.
Yeah, I don't know how many of them have been preserved, but you would think that some of them have.
Okay, we're going to have a short break, and then we will be back with my guest, Steve Daly, and we will discuss the 7 layers of... What did
Pathology.
you... 7 layers of pathology. I'm looking forward to this.
Right.
Thank you, everyone. We will be back very soon.
love me so much more than I could ever know. Your love is deeper than this world will ever show. And all of life's beauty shines around this moment now. The sky and the cliffs, they seem to change my life somehow. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, 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 I will never be the same, never be the same ever again. Here I am waiting, Lord, my life is just for you. Please unfold all the plans that you would have me do. And if all the world's just a breath and nothing's here to stay, and all of the love we feel will save us anyway. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, whoa, I will never be the same, will never be the same ever again. Love me so much more than I could ever know. Your love is deeper than this world will ever show. And all of life's beauty shines around this moment now. The sky and the cliffs, they seem to change my life somehow. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Whoa, 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 I will never be the same, never be the same ever again. Here I am waiting, Lord, my life is just for you. Please Please unfold all the plans that you would have me do. And if all the world's just a breath and nothing's here to stay, then all of the love we feel will save us anyway. And I will never be the same, will never be the same. Oh, I will never be the same, will never be the same ever again.
Hello and welcome back to SDAQ&A. My very special guest today is Steve Daly, all-round nice guy and author. And as I said at the start of our interview, I loved meeting you in February and going along to your church and seeing kind of this other side of you that actually does permeate through even your books that have been called controversial. That pastoral care side of you was great. You've built a really wonderful community there in your church. So I just want to encourage people to go and check out Steve's books. There's more than this, and there's a new one coming, Leaving Adventism, which I can't wait for. Have you got a date for that one?
As soon as I get it done, it's probably going to be 6 months or something. It's
But yeah, I encourage viewers to go and check out Ellen G. White, A Psychobiography, and The White Estate Fraud. So welcome back, everybody. I don't know if there's any things you wanted to, in the comments, you wanted to respond to, but...
Yeah, I will say Michael Pursley's writing a review of The White Estate Fraud and submitting it to Spectrum and AT. We'll see if they accept it. If they don't, he's a really gifted writer and has quite a story himself. He'd probably make a great guest for your show.
Yeah,
Michael
I'd love to. Yeah.
But anyway, if they don't publish his review, I'll publish it on the thread and try to give it as much attention. But there was one question that I was going to just briefly try to respond to.
Sure.
They said, real story about Ellen going to Australia. And like I mentioned, she really pissed off Butler and Smith when she betrayed them at the 1888 conference. And so top church administration, Butler was the GC president, of course, they really lost confidence in Ellen because they saw that she contradicted her own visions. She was willing to sell them down the tubes for her own self-interest and self-benefit. And Butler, of course, had to resign his office. He was out because of what Ellen did to him. Smith was totally fit to be tied. He got really punished too. They put A.T. Jones above him, so he had to be the associate editor when he'd been the editor of the review since 1855. But anyway, she really lost confidence in the top administrators in the church, and they said, hey, this woman she's out of control with the stuff she's doing. And then right then in the very next year, 1889, is when the Hillsburg newspaper, secular newspaper, came out with a whole series of articles exposing Ellen as a plagiarist and concluding. They gave all these examples. There'd been ministerial societies that had Canwright speaking for them, and they had all bought into the fact that Ellen was a plagiarist. So this newspaper series of articles concluded Ellen White is a plagiarist and a literary thief, and they gave all this evidence. So it was really hot for Ellen in the States. And so a combination of those things said they said, we got to get her out of here. Plus, we're sick of her, And Olson was the GC president that got put in, and he was Ellen's handpicked person. But even when she was in Australia, she's blaming him for the fact that she got sent to Australia. She's saying, oh, this wasn't God's will, and you guys just did your own thing. And of course, then she starts colluding with Daniels and setting up their whole strategy for taking over when they get back, which is precisely what they did. So she used her time wisely in Australia to come back with a vengeance and wipe out the next GC leadership and put herself and Daniels in the driver's seat until she died. But, it's funny, even with Daniels, that he knew she had real problems, but he didn't want to admit to that until after she was dead. Then he's pretty candid at the 1990 Bible conference.
That's right.
But anyway,
it's interesting. Ray had said, don't you ever get sick of this? But apart from, like you said, being able to help people out of this confusing, great that people like Kay can find this salvation at the cross through Adventism, but it's a quagmire of just confusion. Right. So it's great that on the one hand you can help people out of it or guide them to the gospel in an easier way, but also you just can't take your eyes off this. Adventism is fascinating, like that whole era of her being in Australia, the politics behind the scenes. She comes back right up to 1919. It's just a fascinating religion.
It's interesting history, to say the least.
Yeah.
But I go ahead with these 7 layers?
Yes, tell us a little about these 7 layers. I'm going to put myself a bit smaller in the screen, and just a quick plug while we've got a big audience watching. Tomorrow's SDAQ&A church, Clinton Baldwin is going to be my gospel presenter. So I just want to let everyone know. Check out that. Okay, I'm just going to minimize myself here, and away you go, Steve. Tell us about these 7 layers.
All right. Well, the first layer is the pre-rock injury, fear, pathology, and suicidal ideation. So before Ellen ever has the rock injury at the age of 9, she's got severe pathology, especially for an 8-year-old kid. This isn't normal. It wasn't something that you found in any of her siblings. She has this extreme abnormal fear of death. She wants to die, but she's afraid to die because she's sure she's going to hell if she does die. And you have to really ask the question, where in the world does she get these ideas? You know, she's not in some grossly legalistic condemning religion or anything. None of the rest of her family's that way. None of the rest of her siblings are that way. And clearly, fear isn't a biblical thing of God. You know, the Bible contrasts fear with love and fear with faith. And fear is of the devil. The devil's the one that wants people to live in fear and all the self-condemnation that is tied to fear. And you know, I've been interested in studying some of these child actors that are featured in the horror films. You know, Chucky and Brad Dourif, Linda Blair and The Exorcist, Tommy Jarvis and Daniel Harris and Friday the 13th. Danny Lloyd was only 6 years old when he was put into The Shining. He didn't even know it was a horror film, you know. The way they manipulated and used some of these kids is unbelievable. But it's remarkable to see how this horror venue of films is loved by so many people and even a lot of children. You know, there's a lot of parents and stuff that allow their kids to watch horror movies and films when they're very young, which is not a good idea. But anyway, what we do know about children, just from child psychology and spirituality, is that kids are a lot more vulnerable and susceptible to spiritual influences. And, you know, it's not uncommon at all for kids to have vivid dreams and think something's under their bed and, you know, have all kinds of kind of fears connected to things when they're little, and they hear things and they listen to things and they hear voices. And there's just a lot of stuff that transpires with kids that adults typically don't experience later in life. And, you know, you contrast the boy Samuel that God speaks to as a kid to Ellen White and her fear and the crazy pathology of her suicidal ideation and all this connected to this fear. And you really have to ask the question, okay, where did this come from? It doesn't seem to come from her parents, doesn't seem to come from her family system, doesn't seem to come from her siblings, doesn't seem to come from any abuse or sexual molestation or physical abuse or the kinds of things that you would seek for, you know. Obviously, there was a real trip about satanic influence on kids several years ago that really took the psychological field by storm. But that's kind of died away now, and people don't talk about it, satanic ritual abuse and all this kind of thing the way they used to. But, you know, to me, when you look at all the evidence here and you try to analyze what are the options here, just as God picks out and selects children at a young age many times, as he did with Samuel, so the devil does the same thing. You know, the devil's interested in getting a hold of children when they're very young, and he loves horror movies and getting kids involved in the occult and this kind of stuff at the very earliest possible age. So, you know, I don't think it's unrealistic at all. I'm going to be very interested to see what Arthur Branner comes up with his book on Ellen White and the occult. I'll be fascinated to see what he's a counselor and stuff. So see what he finds in his digging. But to me, it's actually very likely that there was a demonic or devil influence in Ellen's early life where the devil actually handpicked her, just like he may have done with Mary Baker Eddy and, you know, Joseph Smith and a lot of these cult leaders that were kind of handpicked to be charismatic people that led cults. You know, it would make sense that the devil would want to have influence over these kinds of people, obviously. And there are a number of things that certainly fit with the occult where Ellen is concerned. You know, we talk about all of her references to his satanic majesty, which were so unusual and seemed completely out of place for a Christian to be addressing the devil with this title, His Satanic Majesty, so many, many, many times in her writings. One of the more revealing episodes is in early writings, page 81, where she talks about her spirit guide giving her a coiled, this coiled green thread that she is told to place in her bosom. And it's a coil that she's to unwind when she wants to summon Jesus. And this is straight out of the occult. When you read the terminology there, what she says about knots and not allowing it to get into knots, and then you read the occultic literature about coiled green cords and knots, and I mean, it's like her spirit guide is right out of the occult, what the spirit guide is telling her. And it's certainly not biblical. Since when does God give you a cord to summon Jesus? I mean, whereas these kinds of cords are used in the occult to summon spirits all the time. So that's something that really raises major questions about who her spirit guide was. If she did have a legitimate spirit guide, I would tend to believe that it was on the dark side. It wasn't an angel of God. I believe that she made up a lot of visions. I have no question about that. But I also tend to believe that she did have some unusual, weird spiritual experiences, even at a young age, that made her believe, that she was special, and made her believe that God had kind of handpicked her. And she clearly didn't have the discernment to know that it was the dark side that was picking her and not God. But anyway, that's level one of pathology, is this occult connection and Ellen White's extreme abnormal fear and suicidal ideation, stuff that Adventists never address. They never talk about, why did she have this pathology at the age of 8? Where did it come from? That's a very important question, because that precedes her rock injury. So the next level is the rock injury. And I would subtitle the rock injury as narcissistic manipulation. In my chapter entitled Creative Malady in the psychobiography, I talk about this whole phenomenon of how people use maladies for their own benefit and for their own narcissism and for their own getting ahead in life, getting ahead in the world, learning how to manipulate people, even at a very young age. And my reading of Ellen White isn't that the rock injury did this terrible damage to her, like some Adventist doctors have tried to ascribe all the visions to the rock injury. I don't buy that. To me, the rock injury was simply a broken nose. It hit her in the top of the nose. Initially, she wasn't even knocked out. She wasn't even unconscious. She kept walking with her sister and her friend until the swelling got bad and went into her brain. And that's when she went into the coma. And that swelling was quite substantial for several weeks. So the coma was related to the swelling, but not to any kind of permanent direct brain damage. And when the swelling subsided, her brain was unaffected. She didn't receive brain damage from that broken nose, except for temporary swelling that affected the brain, obviously. But when that subsided, the brain was not injured. And yet what she did learn from that accident was that suddenly she was somebody. She was getting all this attention. Before that, she was just one of 8 children living in a rural and then moving into first a rural, then an urban setting as her father changed professions and became a hatter. And they were a very busy family. She wasn't getting a whole lot of attention. And now she is the total center of attention. Everyone thinks she was going to die. Everyone thinks it's a miracle that she somehow survives this. So now, She doesn't have to go to school anymore. She's the center of attention. She's not having to do female chores. She's absolved from typical female roles. I believe there were a whole bunch of advantages that came to her and that she saw very vividly. And I think that's why she wasn't really all that jazzed about going back to school. They tried to send her back to school twice, and she didn't go along with it, or she failed to get with the program. And you can argue, well, maybe that was physical. I'm much more likely to believe it was psychological. I believe that she really loved being the center of attention. It fit with her personality her whole life, which was a very narcissistic personality. She loved to be the center of attention, and she couldn't stand it when anyone else got more attention than she did. And so this really gave her that ability where she could read and do all kinds of things she wanted to do. And she was no longer expected to carry out roles that were typical of kids that age in her day. It was an age when kids were expected to work and do a lot of chores, and she escaped all that because of her her appeal to physical incapacity. And that would be something she would appeal to her whole life. Every time she would be in a bind or something that was really problematic for her, she would somehow get sick, and she would fall back on, oh no, she's overwhelmed with this physical ailment. And, I think she learned to manipulate people her entire life through this creative malady, if you will. But that's a second level of pathology that Adventists don't seem to recognize or talk about much. The third one, once she got to the age of 12, Ellen started getting spiritual. She was no longer as fearful about spiritual things as she had been, no longer as depressed. Now she was starting to think she was special spiritually somehow. And this is when she got baptized into the Shouting Methodist movement and convinced them that she was having dreams and visions at a very young age. And the Shouting Methodists were about as pathological a religion as you can find. When you talk about extreme, bizarre, crazy, charismatic excesses, fanaticism, these people crawled like animals and shouted and screamed, and it was just absolutely bizarre, their camp meeting settings. And it was all screaming one ring above. They had what they called ring theology, and it was all legalism. Whoever shouted the loudest, the Holy Spirit would come down on them. So you had all these rings competing with each other, drowning out and shouting out the speakers who hated to even go there because they were never heard. And so you had this gross combination of legalism, spiritual arrogance, self-righteousness, combined with the most extreme charismatic excesses you can possibly imagine. And Ellen White fits right into this with her dreams and visions, and they see her as a gifted young woman who's a visionary. And so she is given a certain leadership role even when she's a young teenager in the Shouting Methodists. And that's quite striking in and of itself. First, because she's female. Secondly, because she's so young. And it wasn't all that easy to get leadership in the Shouting Methodists because they were such a bunch of narcissistic, self-centered, weird people. But Ellen managed to get recognition in that group, which is quite interesting. And of course, then she would deny it later. She would deny how fanatical she was, although she gave it away when she talked about being recognized as a leader of the fanaticism in some of her earlier writings. But she goes from one pathology to the next. The reason she gets kicked out of the Methodist Church, which includes the Shouting Methodists, is because she's fallen for Millerism, fallen for date setting. She's bought into all this date setting nonsense, hook, line, and sinker. And there was a whole bunch of date setting. People who think there were just two dates, one in 1843 and one in 1844, don't know what they're talking about. Donald Casebolt has documented the numerous instances of date setting that went even back before 43, but were very plentiful in 43 and even in 44. And, after March of 44, then there's kind of this dormant period until October 22, 44. But there's all kinds of date setting before that. And Adventists never acknowledge or recognize that. So Casebolt has made a nice contribution in his two books. But now you have this end of the world madness with Millerism that Ellen buys into, and she's trying to convert her Methodist church members to go into this, and that's why she gets kicked out. And that shows a lot of pathology too, because she reflects a lot of dishonesty in how she describes being kicked out of the Methodist Church. And I go into that in my psychobiography. I show how she completely denies the true reasons why they were kicked out, which had everything to do with date setting and pushing Millerism on the members when they were warned not to do it, and they just kept doing it. But she says, oh, no, it's because we believed in the second coming, like the Methodists didn't believe in the second coming. That's not, obviously the Methodists did believe in the second coming. They just didn't believe in Millerism or all the fanatical date setting connected with Millerism. And Ellen never owns up to the true reason why they were kicked out, and she denies it and lies about it. And the dishonesty there is very troubling. So, you see this pattern of dishonesty with her in Millerism, in Methodism, and, right up until they're kicked out of the Methodist Church. And like I mentioned, Elizabeth, her twin sister, wasn't kicked out. She was considered a Methodist in good standing, and she remained a nominal Methodist her whole life. And she never bought into Ellen's stuff or Ellen's appeal for her. Ellen would write her letters, oh, I don't want to see you lost, the typical EGW guilt trip. And Elizabeth wanted nothing to do with it. She simply didn't buy the lie. But the next, so far we have pre-rock injury, fear, and pathology. We have rock injury, narcissism, and manipulation. Number 3 is charismania, charismatic chaos, and the shouting Methodists. And that pathological religion. Number 4 is the end of the world madness of Millerism and pathological date setting. And it's funny, when I kind of debated Kevin Morgan on Miles Christian's show, he was trying to say there was no date setting. Ellen White never did any date setting. And I showed him, she did date setting 100% even before she got into Adventism. And she did it in Adventism as well. But many instances. But number 6, the marriage of charismania and fanatical Millerite date setting. That's where Israel Damon comes into the picture. After she gets kicked out of the Methodist Church, and people often wonder, and this was an issue for me too, because I knew Miller was completely anti-charismatic. So I never really spent much time studying Ellen's role in Millerism, because I knew Miller didn't accept prophets. But what I didn't know until Casebolt wrote his book was that there was a segment of Millerism up in Portland, Maine, that was charismatic and that was totally into Millerism and was into date setting. And Ellen White became a big superstar in that group. And she got a bunch of recognition in that little niche. And it's very fascinating to read about that in Casebolt's book. And that's where she gets hooked up with Israel Damon, who is, again, a Millerite and believes in all the date setting weirdness. But he's also every bit as extreme and fanatical in his charismania as the shouting Methodists were. So this guy, it's funny how Ellen hooked up with the most extreme pathological aspects of charismania that you could possibly hook up with. And what's interesting about Israel Damon, of course, is that he gets arrested and Ellen's right in the middle of all that. And she lies about all that. All the other witnesses contradict her. And yet, even with Israel Damon, who had way more than his share of pathology, he still rejects Ellen as a false prophet. So, even someone as pathological as Israel Damon recognized that Ellen was a false prophet when he was already off into all this other weird stuff. So that's quite fascinating that he rejects Ellen as a false prophet as well, and doesn't buy into her stuff. So their relationship was actually quite short-lived. Ellen was like his right-hand person, but it didn't take him long to realize she was a false prophet and reject her, which is quite fascinating for someone as weird as Israel Damon. But anyway, the last one, 7, is the damning testimony of Lucinda Burdick. And this is very important because Lucinda traveled with Ellen. She went from church to church with Ellen. These were little house churches that they traveled to. This was before she met James and hooked up with James, and after she hooked up with James. So Lucinda Burdick was with Ellen both before and after she hooked up with James. And that's important to understand because, in my opinion, she was Ellen's best female friend at that point. Kevin Morgan tries to dispute that, but there wasn't any other woman traveling with Ellen and going from church to church with her and experiencing and witnessing everything Ellen was doing the way that Lucinda Burdick did. But anyway, the bottom line was that Lucinda Burdick also rejected Ellen because of her blatant false prophecies. And the two most dramatic ones were Ellen claiming that Christ would return by the end of June in 1845, which she was speaking in all the churches, and Lucinda witnessed it, heard her say it to individuals on many occasions as well. And then when she was confronted after June passed, she said, "Oh, well, the angel told me in the language of Canaan, and I didn't understand it. It was really the second planting of grass in September, not the first. So the Lord will actually return by the end of September." And of course, September came and went too. Ellen was proved 100% false once again. But, Kevin Morgan tries to get out of this by saying, well, Loughborough and Ellen in 1874 denied that this happened. Oh, that's great. They denied it in 1874. This woman was an eyewitness living with Ellen, seeing her saying this to the churches, to individuals on a daily basis for many, many months, for more than a year that the two of them were together. And once she left Ellen, rejected Ellen, because this stuff was just too much for her. Ellen was getting people to give her money in all the churches with this stuff, manipulating them. And Burdick just ultimately said, I can't accept this anymore. She's obviously a false prophet. And she told Miles Grant that. And Miles Grant wrote his book about it in 1874. So what Adventists try to say is, oh, this stuff wasn't suggested to be true till 1874. That's a total lie. Burdick was saying this stuff in 1845. She rejected Ellen in 1845. She told Miles Grant this stuff in the 1840s. She was an eyewitness to this stuff. And then you've got Loughborough and Ellen come along in 1874 and just deny the whole thing, which Ellen does with the shut door and all kinds of stuff. I mean, we have the absolute documents of the shut door, that the actual statement she made in 1844 to 1851. Then she comes along in 1874 1870s and 80s and say, oh, no, that didn't really happen.
Mm.
I mean, she's a complete liar. Everyone knows she's a liar, and the documents totally reveal that she was a liar about this stuff, and she was just trying to cover up what she was guilty of. But those are the 7 layers of pathology
Mm.
that all are very important to study before Ellen becomes the, quotes, prophet of the Sabbatarian Adventist.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But the Lucinda lady, there's lots of letters between her and Ellen when they were on good terms, aren't there?
Well, no, that's Lucinda Hall.
Oh,
There's
that's
2
right.
Lucindas, and
That's right.
Lucinda Hall is the one that Ellen says, "You're the only one I want to allow into my bed," and brings up all the lesbian weird speculation and everything. Because she's married to James. Of course, they're separated on opposite coasts, but she sends all these intimate letters to Lucinda Hall, and says James is insane. I really believe he's insane, and she completely dogs on her husband in all these intimate letters to Lucinda Hall, along with saying, "You're the only one I want to allow in my bed," which
Wow.
back in those days, it wasn't that super uncommon for 2 women to sleep together in the same bed. But it's weird that Ellen would say, "You're the only one I want to allow in my bed." That's a little strange even for that day.
And
So
where are those letters available?
What's that?
Where are those letters
Those
available?
letters are available in the Heritage Room. They've also been published in a book for women, Daughters of God, I believe it's called. So those are all published, but they're also in the Heritage Room. They're also in the E.G. White vaults that anyone can read those. But Ellen begged her to destroy those letters. Ellen recognized that she'd been way too vulnerable, and that those could be extremely damaging to her. So she begged Lucinda to destroy them, but Lucinda never did it, thankfully,
I
because those
wonder
are.
why she didn't.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Because they were obviously close friends, but maybe she knew the historical significance that, this is the great prophet of the church. And these are obviously very revealing letters. So for whatever reason, I'm sure glad she didn't destroy them, because they tell us a lot, especially about her marriage. The stuff she says about James in those letters, it's hard to believe that a prophet would say that stuff about her own husband. Of course, I don't believe she was a true prophet, so it's not terribly surprising. But
Yeah. And the other Lucinda then that you were just mentioning in your 7th layer.
yeah, Lucinda Burdick.
Yeah. What was her connection with Ellen? And this language of Canaan that you talk about, was that in one of the letters to Lucinda? Lucinda had said to her, "Oh, how come you got that wrong?" Is that where
That's in Lucinda recording what she heard Ellen say to people when they confronted her about Christ not returning in June, because that was her original prophecy, was that Christ would return by the end of June. So when he didn't, and all this goes back to her first vision in Adventism, which is where she says, "The Lord showed me the day and hour of his return." And this is December of 1844. So people are asking her, "Okay, well, if he showed you the day and the hour, when is it?" And that's when she came up with this June date and then the September date. And, she just looked like a complete fool when both of those failed. And that's when Burdick said, "Bye-bye, you're not mentally stable, and you're ripping people off for their money by all these false prophecies and stuff."
Yeah. Boy.
That's another thing I won't bring up tonight, but that's Ellen White, illegal, unethical, and immoral financial behaviors. I've got 7 major things there that we'll talk about some other time. That's going to be in the new book too, where I go into more detail about her financial scandals than I do in the psychobiography.
Can't wait for that book. I titled today's program Ellen G. White, A Prophet. Hang on, I think. Oh, I hope I didn't cut us off there. No, we're still here.
No, I still hear you.
We're still here.
Yeah.
I can't open it, but I think I called Ellen G. White a prophet with a question mark. It just unpack for me this notion where she said herself, and I think, as you just said, you don't believe she was a prophet. Neither do I. But a lot of people say, well, she didn't claim to be a prophet. Adventists have this wonderful, the Adventist apologists have this great little loops they can go into that just kind of, it's like a magic trick where they divert your attention and then they change something here. And how do you answer someone that says that? Well,
I mean, it's such a lie, because right in that same thing, she says, my work includes much more than that of a prophet. So, she's basically saying, hey, I'm above and beyond a prophet. I'm not one of these little wimpy prophets. I'm the woman. I am the last day mega prophet. And when you look at the statement she makes for her writings, her claims, they're just absolute blasphemy. And, there's nothing coy about them. Everything I write in the paper comes directly from the throne of God. I mean, that's not being subtle. That's just being outright. And all of her other stuff being the spirit of prophecy, and on she goes. This, when you're claiming to be the spirit of prophecy and calling yourself that, that's a joke to say she didn't think she was a prophet. I mean, it's completely ridiculous, the claim she makes for herself. And that's really Adventism's biggest problem, is the claim she makes for herself. That's why Larson's thing about, Team Ellen, this was just this team that worked together. No, that's nonsense. She claimed to be the actual voice of God, period. And, she doesn't give you any wiggle room. Butler tries to say, we can't treat her all or nothing. She doesn't give you any choice but to treat her all or nothing. There's no other option when she's making the absolute claims and saying they came from God. She doesn't leave you with the option of not being all or nothing. She's all or nothing with herself. And so we have to deal with that, as unpleasant as that is, because, how many people make those kinds of claims for themselves? There's a lot of professed prophets in history, but you don't find hardly any that make the kind of absolute claims for themselves that Ellen does. And that's just ridiculous.
And that particular claim where she said she wasn't a prophet and then doubled down that she was more than a prophet, that was a week or two apart, weren't they? Those statements or comments. Do you remember?
I think it's, at least in some of her writings, they're said consecutively.
Yeah.
She's had her writings edited and reworked, and, but I believe there's at least one occasion where she couples the two together and says, my work includes much more than just that of a prophet.
A prophet, yeah. And Dr. Ez writes, and hey, Dr. Ez, good to have you watching today. Exactly. She claims to be more than a prophet.
Absolutely.
Just while I've got you here, can you tell us a little bit more about the cider situation where she was apparently drinking alcohol?
The vinegar?
Yeah, the vinegar. Yeah, the alcoholic vinegar or something. What?
Yeah. I mean, vinegar is not addicting. So these statements she makes, which fit with, severe alcoholism and even potential death from alcohol use, could not possibly just apply to vinegar. And she made all kinds of homemade wine. Back in those days, there were a lot of weird things that happened with homemade beer and homemade wine. And there weren't a whole lot of controls many times, and people didn't always get the alcohol contents right. And, she was making all kinds of alcohol for her alcoholic drink wine for her neighbors, for friends. Many Adventists who received stuff from her justified drinking alcohol based on her giving them gifts of wine that were alcoholic. And, it wasn't just for medicinal purposes like Adventists try to suggest. Her diary makes it clear that she was addicted to these homemade wines and alcohols, and the vinegar alcohol combination was clearly one of her favorite. But I think the reason she tried to focus on vinegar was she was very aware of the words she'd written against alcohol. Not a drop is to be touched to the lips. And she knew she was defying that and completely at odds with that. So I think she was trying to hide her alcohol addiction by blaming it on vinegar, which of course is nonsense. It wasn't just vinegar. And, she also condemned vinegar use, which is, even if she was trying to say it was just vinegar, she was still defying what God had showed her, that no, vinegar was to be used. And she went after doctors even who used vinegar. So, that's a very fascinating thing that and of course it was just in her diary. It wasn't like she made a public repentance of her alcoholism or anything. This was just in her diary. She was acknowledging that she was on the verge of death because of her vinegar addiction, as she called it, which was clearly an alcohol vinegar addiction, because vinegar is an addiction.
Yeah, okay.
And it wouldn't be drunk. Vinegar by itself wouldn't be drunk in the,
Yeah.
Mimi
West writes moonshine.
Yeah, absolutely.
And was she?
Yeah, she made all kinds of moonshine, and she wasn't adverse to defying all her health message, whether it's butter, pork, oysters. She wasn't a respecter of defying her health message. She did it right across the board, and she was anything but a health specimen. She was overweight. She didn't take her exercise seriously. She didn't take her diet seriously, but she was sure good at condemning anyone for anything that was the most legalistic, one drop of this. And I mean, her language is just so absolutely legalistic and perfectionistic in what she writes. And then her behavior is so completely opposite and hypocritical that you really have to say, this woman must not have seriously really believed God was speaking to her, or else she's like just flipping off God and spitting in God's face every day. So, my own guess is that she knew, first of all, that she was conning people. Secondly, she did have some spiritualistic, occultic connections that she used to try to make people believe that she was in touch with God. But that wasn't the case. I don't believe God ever gave her a true vision. And the White Estate claims over 2,000 visions. That's just nonsense. Because so many of them, it's obvious she just made them up. It's like when you look at the first offshoot, the Messenger Party, these are two ministers, and she has a vision siding with them one day, and then she hears some rumor, and she has a vision the next day that's the exact opposite. And these guys go crazy, and they start to just research into her stuff and realize she's a complete fraud. And they also accuse James. This is in early 1850s. They're the first ones to accuse James of financial fraud and ripping off the Review and Herald monies. And that's one of the things I talk about in the 7 levels of financial fraud and stuff that the whites were involved with.
You just reminded me, I read somewhere, and I think it was in one of your books, about James doing something with getting them to sell books that weren't selling.
Right.
What was
That
that story
that
again?
comes from Canwright. Canwright was living with them, and they had a whole bunch of outdated books that were no longer marketable that they personally owned. And rather than just throw them in the trash like they deserved, James came up with the idea, how can we make money off these books? And his idea was we can get the church to buy all these books from us and then send them to the mission field, give them free as a gift to the mission field.
Right,
But
right,
the church will have to buy them all from us.
right.
And so the whites made a whole bunch of money off this that Canwright witnessed and was very disillusioned by. This was before he even,
Left.
began to strongly doubt or question Ellen White. But, he was saying he has a whole chapter 11 in his Ellen White book that is all about their financial fraud and stuff. And it's included.
I think it might be in that
Yeah,
book.
The Life
Yeah.
of Ellen White, chapter 11.
Yeah.
It's in that particular chapter where he talks about they
Yeah.
made money off her gift.
I also remember reading at one point where they were traveling from church to church or household to household, and in winter and all times of year in the back of this, in a buggy and whatnot. But in a conversation, and again, I don't have the specifics, but there was talk, he was talking to Ellen about the price of these little pamphlets. And I remember thinking, this is years ago, I remember thinking, hang on, in today's money, that would be this much. And, they were selling these little, I think, Plain Truth pamphlets or whatever.
Yeah, they had a ton of
and I-
stuff that they.
And I thought they would have been making a bit of money going,
Yeah, just
everywhere
the
they
dress-
went, they were selling these pamphlets.
Just the dress patterns that Ellen was pushing on all the women through quotes visions were $1 a piece, which is the equivalent of $25 a piece just for a dress pattern that she was pushing and saying, hey, you have to be wearing this reformed dress if you're going to be translated, if you're going to be ready to
Shown
meet
to her direct from God.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, she did the same thing when James tried to pull off that scam with their old books.
Yeah.
The people weren't buying it. No one wanted to buy them. So Ellen starts having all these visions that you're going to hell if you don't support this mission work of the church and stuff. I mean, it's just so completely manipulative and self-serving. When you look at so many of her visions, they're just, are you serious? People are really going to take this seriously?
Yeah. That what I've noticed doing the interviews is that even the progressive, more liberal Adventists who I felt had a better perspective of her involvement are Ellenists as well. There's something about Ellen that they all just love. They just love her. And so when you criticize her, someone wrote a little bit earlier, is it fair to, I can't remember what the exact words were, but is it fair to kind of criticize her when she's not here to defend herself? And how would she defend herself?
Yeah, I mean, it's source documentation. It's anytime you talk about history, you have to go with the source documents. And in our particular situation with Ellen, there's an absolute ton of source documentation. And that's to her definite disadvantage. And the fact that the church has tried to cover it all up and deny it is another major problem where people don't like that. Someone asked, it was either on my Facebook page or on my thread, how could so many intelligent people be deceived by a third grade educated woman? And, it's very important to understand that intelligence isn't something that transcends the amount of information a person has. In other words, intelligence has to be measured on the basis of what information a person is dealing with. And they can be the most brilliant person in the world, but if they have a ceiling on the information that they're subjected to, then they can have all the intelligence in the world, but they're not going to get beyond that ceiling. And that's what cults do. They limit the information of those in the cult. So it doesn't matter if the person's brilliant or not. They're encircled by this ceiling of information that they can't get beyond. And that's why Adventism is a cult. It shelters, it denies, it hides, it censors, it does everything it can to keep its people from getting at the truth. And, that's why it's so freeing when people find the truth and realize, holy Toledo, this truly is a cult. It really.
I found like I would have been considered a liberal, progressive, fringe Adventist, I guess, with my music and whatnot. But I recall back my memories of always feeling I had to defend Ellen, and it's such a relief not feeling you have to defend her anymore.
Yeah,
Just that one thing alone.
for sure.
Motor Sapien writes, Dr. Daly, do you think there are any contradictions in the Bible or prophets from the Bible who are wrong? I think he's perhaps saying, well, if Ellen made mistakes and whatnot, couldn't she? And I might be wrong, Motor Sapien, but he could be saying, well, prophets in the Bible also had contradictions and whatnot.
Right. I think the level,
Ellen.
when you compare the Bible writers from my perspective to Ellen White, it's such a contrast that it's not even worthy of a serious comparison. The Bible writers are not con artists. They're not ripping people off. They're not exploiting people. We don't have the original manuscripts. And so, I don't believe in inerrancy or that kind of thing, but I believe the Bible is inspired by God in the ways it needs to be for salvation, spiritual health, spiritual growth. And that's not the case with Ellen. I mean, she's a copycat. She's a thief. She's a plagiarist. She's a liar. She's an immoral person. She's someone ripping people off. She's making blasphemous claims for herself. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So when Adventists try to drag the Bible or the Bible writers down to the level of Ellen, I find that to be very distasteful.
Dr. Ayres writes, Ellen needs to be tested by the Bible prophets. The Bible prophets are not to be tested by Ellen.
Yeah.
And I think humans make mistakes, and maybe there's evidence of Bible prophets making mistakes, but they're not the kind of mistakes we're talking about with Ellen, where she was claiming to be given direct messages that turned out to be totally false. I remember reading something about her, I think, visiting the 1908 earthquake or something in San Francisco, and for years I'd been told that she'd predicted it. And then when I read what she'd actually said, she said, oh, I saw this in vision a couple of weeks ago. And I thought, well, okay, that doesn't give it the same kind of profound.
Yeah, they do the same thing with the Twin Towers. She has this kind of vague statement about New York. And, Adventists they're desperate. They're really desperate to try to salvage this woman. But the evidence just gets more and more overwhelming that both the woman and the church are guilty of very sad and tragic immorality.
Yeah. Motor Sapien writes, I'm not totally sure what he's saying here, but Peter, you hit the nail on the head about Ellen G. White not here to defend herself. How can I trust Daly about Ellen G. White, someone neither of us knew, when I know he's wrong about Maxwell, someone he did know?
Which Maxwell is he talking about?
I think that's the Graham Maxwell. Is that right, Motor Sapien? I'm not sure. You might know more about what he means with that than I do.
I don't have anything against Graham Maxwell. I took a class from him, and I don't share the same theology as Maxwell does, but that's not anywhere near. If he's talking about Mervyn Maxwell, at the seminary, I found him to be an apologist historian that was dishonest. And I was quite put off by his dishonesty as a professor of history.
And
But
I think Motor Sapien, when I chatted with Steve about this another time, we got our Maxwell's mixed up. So I'm pretty sure that Steve wasn't putting down Graham Maxwell.
right.
And
I don't agree with Graham on everything, but
no.
I don't dislike Graham or feel that he was a bad, harmful person, whereas I did feel that way about his brother Mervyn.
And their father was the Bible stories guy, was it? Arthur.
Yeah. That was Uncle Arthur.
Yeah.
And
Mervyn and Graham were his sons.
the other Maxwell was the president of PUC, so they were all over the place, those Maxwell boys.
Yeah, okay.
Malcolm Maxwell was the one that was up at PUC, I believe.
Oh, he's got here, yes, claiming Maxwell taught moral influence.
Yeah, I mean, some people think Maxwell taught moral influence. Maxwell's not here to say whether he did or didn't, but obviously some people understood his theology to be lean more that direction. But I don't have any gripe with the Loma Linda Maxwell. I feel like he did a lot of good. I liked his emphasis on love, seeing God from a perspective of love. He had a lot of good things to say. I enjoyed his class. So just because I have a more Brinsmead view of justification, at least Brinsmead when he was in his prime, in my opinion. Just because I lean more his direction than Maxwell doesn't mean that I have anything against Maxwell.
Right. Yeah, and I think Motor Sapien, we might have mixed up the two in a prior interview. I know I got it wrong when I was talking to Steve last time about it. But yes, so hopefully that clears it up, Motor Sapien. We're definitely talking about Graham, and in the past we may have been talking about Mervyn.
Yeah.
And I inaccurately was saying to Steve the wrong one.
I mean, Mervyn's the historian, and that's more the field that I'm writing in is Adventist history. So it was a lot more likely that I would be criticizing Mervyn Maxwell than Graham Maxwell.
And with the idea of that it's potentially unfair to criticize someone like Ellen White if she's not here to defend herself, what do you think? What right do people like you and I and others have to put her under the spotlight?
I mean, it's a good question. Obviously, Adventists don't like it, but that's what history is. That's what the study of history is. You try to seek out and understand historical documents, source documentation, the best you possibly can, and try to be as honest with it as you possibly can. And for someone to say that, oh no, that's just off limits if a person has died. I mean, history's never been done that way. History's always continues on based on the evidence, and when new evidence is unearthed, that's taken into consideration. And there are many cases in history where people had a certain reputation when they were alive, and that was blown to bits when documentation was discovered after their death. And that's going to particularly be true if a person's very deceitful, very dishonest, very hypocritical, always covering up their stuff, always denying and lying. I mean, the evidence is so overwhelming that Ellen White did that stuff that you have to answer on the other side too. What about all the people Ellen has hurt and is hurting? Are you just going to let her continue doing that when we have strong evidence to show that people are being badly hurt because of her plagiarisms,
Mm. And
lying.
maybe if they didn't have the ongoing authority, which I think they have watered down in the recent
Yeah. I
28
mean,
fundamental.
they're trying to minimize her authority, but she makes the claims that she makes,
Mm.
and there's no getting around it. Those statements are just so outrageous, and there's so many of them that as much as Adventists would love for them to go away, they're not going to go away,
Yeah.
and they have to be dealt with. And when people make those kinds of claims, I mean, I would sure hope that you want to hold them accountable for making those kinds of absolute claims,
Mm.
basically saying, I'm the voice of God,
Yeah.
I mean, that's some sick stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Andy Mack writes, Ellen's view is affecting many lives now, so we must question motives, etc.
Absolutely.
And Two Cracked Eggs, I like the name there, Two Cracked Eggs. Her words live on to be authoritative in the SDA space. It is fair
Absolutely.
game to question her.
Absolutely.
She
When
has,
you make her kinds of claims, you
Yeah.
better be ready to be challenged.
yeah, yeah.
Those
Yeah.
are outrageous claims.
Mate, I could talk to you for hours, and we literally have you've probably done 5 interviews together, I think. I think 3 of the interviews I've done with you, of 300 interviews, are in the top 10 SDA charts. And so obviously whenever you and I chat, people want to listen to what you've got to say. So I really appreciate you being on the program.
Well,
Is there
thanks.
anything
It's
you want
always a
to...
pleasure.
It is. I always love it. Is there anything you'd like to kind of...
I just, always invite people to check out the thread. We have fun discussions every day, and my website is authorstevedaily.com. So we post things up there, and there's always stuff there. So, I enjoy, I guess what I'm most thrilled about now is all these young voices like Thunder and Miles and Michael. And I just love the fact that these young people have a passion for continuing to hold the church accountable for what they've done.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's exciting times, and if there really are, 46 million, not all living, I'm sure now, but who have left the Adventist Church since the 60s, and there's currently allegedly 25 million Adventists. There's a big audience out there. That's 46 million people who have left, and like we were chatting earlier,
Yeah.
a lot of people have left but haven't taken their names off the roll.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's really much closer to 3-1, even as a conservative figure.
Yes. Yeah.
Of course, we know the 25 million is a bunch of bull. There's nowhere near 25 million Adventists in the world. I think 6 million is much, much, much closer. So even if you take 3 to 4 times that, that's still a lot of people, 18 to 24 million people out there that are former Adventists that are still alive.
Yeah.
Which I think that's a lot more realistic, but
yeah.
certainly worth trying. I love having all the people on the thread become a community and share and, support each other every day. And we always have our apologists in there too, but
yeah. I always enjoy checking in. When Steve talks about the thread, that's Steve Daly on Facebook. Go and find that. There's a daily post that you make there. I like how you'll refer to other people's comments.
Stephen G. Daly, PhD, there's a bunch of Steve Dalys in the world, so
Yeah,
that's why I put Stephen G. Daly, PhD, as the Facebook page
handle.
so they can get to it easily.
I'd love to have you back on. Like you may have noticed, we've done 3 SDAQ&A church, where once a week now we have a gospel presentation, totally unfiltered by anything Ellen White or Adventist just the
Mhm.
gospel. And I'd
That's
love you to
great.
come and do one for us one day, if that was all right.
What days of the week is it?
It's usually on the Thursday, 6:30 p.m. your time.
6:30 on Thursday.
On a
Is it
Thursday.
like a half-hour sermon,
Yeah,
basically?
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
I just say to people, look, do 30 or 40-minute talk. I hand it over to you. I sit back and listen and enjoy. And we've had Frank Berendino, Rick Dingman, Mike Colburn, and tomorrow we've got Clinton Baldwin.
Amen. I love to
I-
preach the gospel, so I'm sure
I'd
I
love
can
to have you on. And like I say, it is just a
work
30
it
to
in.
40-minute presentation. Dr. Ez, if you're still watching, I'd love you on to do another one for me as well. You did one in Voice Life Fellowship for me. I'd love you to do one here at SDA Church
So
too.
is this purely an online church that you have?
It's here on SDA Q&A, so the same audience, but all we do is if we spend one program a week dedicated just to the gospel.
But there's not a physical location where you're meeting.
No physical location.
Okay.
Yeah, not yet.
So I would just come on like I did right
Yeah,
now
yeah.
and give a sermon for 30 or 40
Yeah,
minutes.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Sure, we can line it up.
that'd be awesome.
We'll find a date that works and go
Yeah,
for it.
that'd be fantastic.
That's
Well,
great.
we'll say farewell for now. Thank you, everyone, for watching. And go and check out everything Steve Daly. Just Google him. You'll find all sorts of exciting resources.
God
Thank
bless
you.
you, Peter. You're doing a wonderful work.
Thank you, Steve. That means a lot coming from you. I really appreciate it. And everyone, we'll see you all tomorrow for
God bless.
Clinton Baldwin. And Steve, we'll see you again soon.
All right. Thanks, Peter. Talk to you later.